Okay.
Purity, yeah.
So since we have lovely new...
No.
They're testing.
Ignore that one.
They're probably
So since we have lovely new faces,
No.
and some of us are catching our breath, welcome to Introduction to Theological Aesthetics with your teacher, Dr. Christi Williams. Christi has her PhD from Baylor, has worked for HBU, works with HCC, and now Trinity Classical School, which meets here a couple days a week.
Amen.
So we will be getting deep into the theology of beauty. We figured we will be starting 2,315 years ago and coming forward in just 6 weeks, 6 sessions. So get your thinking caps on. Christi has spoken at Imago. At least we've roped her into twice before. And she's so nice, she hasn't said no yet. So we kept asking her to come and talk and do more talks. She has an excellent method for taking really high and lofty concepts and bringing them down to the level of mere mortals such as myself that we can understand. And so definitely no one has been more excited about this than me, partially because I'm not going to be the teacher this 6 weeks, and also because I want to. This is a hard subject to learn on your own, and so we're very grateful and blessed to have a good guide with us. So, Christi.
Thank you. I was telling my 6th graders, I teach 6th graders on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I was telling them that I was doing this tonight and that I wanted them to pray for me. And I was like, I have to get them excited about Plato and Aristotle. And they were like, you'll do it. You made us excited about Plato. So I was like, oh, okay, thank you. So anyway, I was talking with some of the people here in the parking lot just about the method that I'm taking for the class. And so I'm taking, as far as the organization, and if you look at the sort of schedule, you can see how I've sectioned it. We're doing sort of a chronological sort of read through of the conversation about beauty. And so even though this is a class about theological aesthetics, which means beauty as it relates to God, we're starting tonight 300 years before Christ came. With Plato and Aristotle, who never were exposed to the scriptures of the New Testament, because a lot of the people who write after Plato and Aristotle are reading them and are actually asking the question, how much of what they said can we take as truth, and how much of it changes now that we have the scriptures and we have divine revelation as it's revealed. So I think, I sometimes call the people that came before the New Testament unspoiled pagans. So there's spoiled pagans, which are pagans who have benefited from revelation, but then come up with ideas and think that they're original, but they're really a lot of times not. You can find them in the scriptures. But then unspoiled pagans who came before the scriptures don't, they really have nothing to go on, and tend to have a sense of needing more, and looking for something that they don't have. And so I think that they are actually a good preparation to get you to a place of realizing your ignorance, so then you can encounter the scriptures and see the sort of answer that they offer. So tonight we're going to talk about the 2 big ancient philosophers, and I want to just give an overview timeline, just because when I went to school before college, all of my historical understanding was given to me in bits and pieces. I was just never given this narrative of the way time and history works together, and it was always super emphasized in U.S. history, and so even anything that happened outside of the last 300 years was almost off the radar screen. And so I think it's just helpful to think about the trajectory, the conversation through time, and see sort of where we're fitting our conversation now and where we're headed. So basically, Plato and Aristotle they come up around the 300s BC. And sometimes they're called the trilogy of thinkers, because what you actually have are Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, and then Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And Socrates never wrote anything down, so Plato listened to the conversations that Socrates had and then wrote works with Socrates as the main character in dialogues. And a lot of Plato's early work is kind of thought to be Socrates' thought, and then Plato's later works are kind of thought to be his own thought as he developed it in his own sort of maturity. Aristotle studied under Plato for 20 years. Plato died. Aristotle thought Plato was going to leave the academy to him, but it went to like Plato's cousin, and Aristotle was very ruffled about that. So he went off and studied by himself for a while and came back and started his own academy. His thought is sometimes pitted against Plato's, and it's definitely true that philosophers often are either more Platonists or more Aristotelians, because Plato's more of a poetic thinker, and Aristotle's more of a scientific one, and so often it goes with just personalities. And tonight I am going to talk about a little bit about some of the disagreements that they had about the approach to beauty, but I think there's also a lot of commonality, and maybe more than people give them credit for. And there's so much that they wrote about and saw that often people say that everything after Plato and Aristotle is just a footnote to them in the history of philosophy. It's very hard to find a question that they didn't ask, or a possible answer that they didn't suggest. So I brought, I think everyone should own Plato's complete works and Aristotle's complete works. I brought my copies, one set of them, Plato and Aristotle. Plato's the greatest thinker to be able to, you can sit down and read one of his dialogues in an evening. They're that short. Not the Republic. There's a few that are longer, but a lot of them are short and just extremely enjoyable. So Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and these are generally referred to as the ancients. And then you have Christ, which actually is around 4 BC. And in the history of philosophy, that's the big cutoff line where you get then what's called the medievals. And that goes to around 1320 when you have the Renaissance beginning. And in between this span of time, the medievals, the two biggest, there's really two big thinkers, just like there's Plato and Aristotle here, the two being Augustine, who comes in the 300s AD. So it's kind of easy to remember because these are 300s BC, he's 300s AD. He's taking Plato and kind of Christianizing him, baptizing him, and asking like, what can we take and what do we have to leave off? The other big one is Aquinas, who comes around the 1300s. And he is doing with Aristotle what Augustine is doing with Plato. Augustine is a more poetic writer like Plato. Aquinas is a more scientific writer like Aristotle. So ancients, medievals, and I ran out of room, but you have two more time periods: moderns, postmoderns.
Could you repeat the part about who's more like who?
Yeah. So Augustine is more like Plato, and these two are the more poetic thinkers. There's actually a famous painting by Michelangelo, School of Athens painting, and it's all the philosophers standing on steps, and in the middle are two. Those two are actually Plato and Aristotle. Plato, one of the thinkers, has his hand pointing up to the heavens, and that's Plato. And Aristotle's standing next to him, and he has his hand right here. And Plato liked to think about what God and heaven was like, the life after death, beauty, and everything that transcends what we have here and now. And that's why he was more of a poetic thinker. Aristotle was a scientist. He liked to think about this life, what happiness means here. So Augustine then was really became a Platonist, and then Plato led him to Christianity. And then Aquinas, again, did the same thing with Aristotle. So Then you have the Renaissance and what's called the Enlightenment. And this is sort of the science explosion, when the focus kind of turns from being on God to on what man can do through his own power and his own reason. And so you have a lot of really amazing painters and thinkers, but you also have the birth of modern science and the scientific method. And so the modern philosophers tend to, and you have a few. We're gonna, let's see, who do we have on the list to talk about? Kant and Nietzsche. So Kant is one major one. You don't have like two main thinkers like you do in these time periods, but a lot of them are more concerned with certainty than wisdom. So for these philosophers, philosophy is about the love of and pursuit of wisdom. In modernity, when science becomes in some ways more important than philosophy, the question is, what can you prove? If you can't prove it, even if it's wisdom, it's not going to be taken seriously. And in certain ways, philosophy wants to earn science's approval, as opposed to the other way around. Philosophy was kind of the queen of the sciences in this part time. So that's the moderns. Postmoderns, it's really debatable when it starts. I tend to say around the 1800s. Some people will say the 20th century is where it starts, but and there's so many different points of view that fall under this category. But post just means after, and after moderns, and so what really draws them together is an argument against modernity. Basically, and often what it has to do with is in a belief that a reason alone approach to truth is not going to work. That either you need faith to, you need experience to, or some of them that become more atheist will say, well, if we can't get it through reason alone, we can't get at truth at all. So maybe a little bit more pessimism. Here it's sort of like through knowledge we can like take over the world, cure all diseases, live forever. Here you have all of the violence of the 20th century, people that are Nazis, that are brilliant, that are still doing horrific things. And so there's a little bit more of an awareness of the finitude and fallenness of man, and sort of grappling with that. So so this is sort of history in 4 segments. And when I learned to understand history this way, and of course it can always be split up in all sorts of different ways, it did help me a lot as I learned new things. Even when I learned that Shakespeare fell in this time period, or even just that the Bible was written in this time period, and where that falls in the conversation, it sort of started to make a lot of things make more sense. So, any questions before I erase all of that and go back to our ancients? Yes.
One question about postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
I've always kind of, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've always kind of seen it as a rejection of the tried and true that has failed, and an acceptance of almost anything that comes down the pipe.
Right. So here's what I think. I think that you kind of have 2 camps in postmodernism. I think it veers off in 2 directions. I think one direction is the more atheist and or agnostic sort of group that is going to say, okay, so science is the only way to get at truth. If science failed, then we don't get anything. So it's all relative. It's what culture you're from, what your emotions are, who has the best argument, will to power, that kind of thing. And you have Nietzsche, who's definitely in this category, and a lot of popular culture. A lot of times philosophy tends to trickle down. Sometimes it takes about 50 years or 100 years to get to pop culture level. And so a lot of atheist postmodernism is just everywhere in our culture. The other direction that it takes that is more theist, and theist meaning just a belief in God and in truth, tends to, I think in a really healthy way, say to science, well actually, first of all, certainty isn't the same thing as wisdom. And so it might be that what we can gain through faith could be even more precious of a treasure than what we can prove through scientific experiment. In that the way that we know is limited. So we aren't going to just present a proof for God's existence and then like convert the whole world. But we can see through glass darkly. But the claim is that it requires faith. It requires revelation. It requires community. It requires all these things that are not clean and exact like a mathematical theorem. And so I tend to really like theistic postmodernists. A lot of them also are looking at retrieving the medievals and ancients, and they're saying, look, the moderns wanted us to get rid of these thinkers and say, well, we're always progressing forward, so everything behind us is like primitive and no one knew anything back then, and now that we have science, we know it all. Theistic postmodernists tend to say, there's actually a ton of wisdom here that we've forgotten about, and we need to go back and retrieve it.
Well, because you've got the word theist in there doesn't mean they're necessarily believer postmodernists.
Right. So what it is it's more of an openness to an absolute truth, and a belief that we can have maybe dim but access to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay. One thing I love about the school I teach at is the grades are split up into these time periods. So first graders study the ancients, second graders the medievals, in third grade the moderns, fourth grade postmoderns, and then in fifth grade you start over and you do ancients. And then I teach sixth grade and they do medievals, seventh graders the moderns, eighth graders postmoderns, and then they do another cycle in high school. So they go through that 3 times, and all of their subjects are related to that. And it just, I'm like, I wish I got that. I would have liked school so much more. So, anyway. Okay, so moving to our 2 thinkers for tonight. So just to reveal my cards, I do like Plato more than Aristotle. I do love Aristotle, and like the more I teach him, the more I appreciate him. But I like the way that Plato is okay with saying he doesn't know, and saying in some ways you grow in wisdom as you grow to know what you don't know. But I have like I want you guys to love them both. So I'm gonna do my best to give you some of the jewels of both. So starting with Plato, a really big thing that pervades his thought is the belief in what he calls 3 transcendentals, and those 3 things that he thinks that we, in some ways, should always be looking for, or maybe even can't help looking for, are truth, goodness, and beauty. And they're transcendentals because they transcend. They're things that are there regardless of things coming to life and dying, people changing countries, changing time periods. Truth, goodness, and beauty are always things that every culture and every time period has talked about, has sought, has had some sort of opinion about. Now, different philosophers, it's interesting, tend to privilege one of the 3 over the others. Or say they're all the same. I think most philosophers tend to, there's like one of them that they think is sort of the crowning one. And for Plato, the crowning one is goodness. And I think that that's going to actually have a lot of import as to what he ends up saying about beauty, which is sort of our area that we're asking about in this class. So the reason that he thinks goodness has to have supremacy to truth and beauty is that he says you can have truth, something that's true, but that is evil. You can have something that's true that is ugly. You can have something that is beautiful but lacks goodness. You can also have something that's beautiful but is a lie. You can't have something that's good that isn't also true and beautiful. even Christ, the suffering servant, which you could say he lacks beauty. Isaiah 53 says he had no beauty that men would look upon him. I would argue that even he is beautiful, and that what Christianity does is it changes the definition of what beauty is. And that in some ways that's the most beautiful thing, is him suffering for us. And so Plato thinks that if you grab a hold of this one or this one, and try to have it without this, without submitting it to this, that you go into corruption very quickly. And so in certain ways, a pursuit of beauty, a pursuit of truth, always has to have goodness as its sort of higher standard that it's always submitting itself to. I think there's kind of an analog in Christianity to this, in the claim that God is love. And that of faith, hope, and love, the other two faith that love is the strongest. I mean, there's also claims that Christ is the truth, and in a lot of ways, I think in the scriptures, the three just go together. But there are a lot of ways in which beauty is spoken of in the scriptures as being misleading sometimes, or that things can be true but not embraced the right way. So Satan believes that Christ is the Son of God. He knows that that's true, but that's not enough. He doesn't love Christ. So that aspect of goodness isn't there. So all of what Plato is doing in certain ways is looking at the ways in which these three things show up in the world, how they can be isolated from one another and then corrupted because of that, and what to be aware of to keep these things from being isolated from goodness. And he's especially, in the Greek culture, there was a love of Homer, a love of poetry, there was sculpture, there's these beautiful Athenian buildings. So people loved beauty, loved the human form, and he was often very wary of beauty being idolized above goodness. And so a lot of people think of Plato as being anti-artist. I don't think he is, but I think that he's very concerned that it not be put into the wrong hands. I think that what he thinks ultimately is that, and one of maybe my favorite dialogue by him is, it's not as commonly read, it's called the Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus, which is kind of a dialogue about love, he talks a lot about beauty, and one of the things that he says is that of these three, he thinks beauty is the thing that the most human beings have access to being affected by right away, without their soul being cultivated in any way. So, someone who's not cultivated toward truth, or toward goodness, it's harder to win their desires over when you present them with truth, or when you present them with goodness. Truth can be not as interesting as cleverness, or they might prefer to be blissfully ignorant or something, and goodness could seem naive to them, not as interesting as evil or something. I feel like people that love the Joker and Batman think that evil is more interesting than goodness. But he says beauty, it's just something that can touch even the least cultivated soul. Now, I think it does take cultivation to appreciate higher forms of beauty. I remember when I was little, I didn't love classical music automatically, and my dad told me if you just expose yourself for these long periods of time, you'll cultivate this love of it. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it, and I did, and it totally worked, but it took a while. But it really is true that almost anyone can just be blown away. You can find some form of beauty that can blow their soul away, even if it's not really cultivated at all. So he says, in certain ways, it's the most important of the transcendentals because it's the one that has the power, in some ways the most power to affect the most people. But he says it's also the most dangerous because it's so powerful that it can sort of trap you so that you stop there. And you don't actually go from beauty onto goodness or onto truth. It's almost like it becomes this this thing that satisfies your pleasures, but not your mind, and not your actions. You can be a really good connoisseur of wine, but like an evil person, and like not even struggle about that. And so in the Phaedrus, he talks about this problem, this awesome thing about beauty, and this problem with it. And I think for me as an artist, I think that I kind of sort of try to keep that on my mind. The way in which art has that power to automatically hit a person's soul, but also possibly the most easily idolized of the three of these things. Okay. Before I go to the next point, any questions on that? Or like, I love when people disagree with me. So like, if you just think I'm like, this is so wrong, yeah, like tell us why. I might learn something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Just an observation.
Mm-hmm.
We in the last 6 weeks we spent some time with the suffering servant, and one of the commentaries, going through Isaiah that I found, said that Isaiah was essentially making a case for, so this servant that called the hand of God in Isaiah was going to deliver the people, and he had none of the qualities that those people esteem. Yes. Which, guilt by association, which we esteem. Right. And so the commentator was saying he is challenging our very definition of beauty or perceived goodness. Yes. As we've got it all wrong. Yeah. And I just found that very challenging. Absolutely. So those things that naturally I appeal to, whether it's a sunset or a person, right? The might not necessarily be the God's definition, or I might not be seeing his definition. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that Plato is really intent upon is taking our experience of the physical, wanting our experience of the physical things that are good, that are true, that are beautiful, to propel us beyond themselves to the things that are spiritually good and true and beautiful. So that there's almost this bridge or gateway that the physical provides. So you experience a beautiful sunset, and yes, it's beautiful, but it actually doesn't stop there. It takes you to then the thought of the beautiful God that created this beautiful sunset. And so that the physical always sort of is this sign that points beyond itself. And not that it isn't good in itself, but that it's wrapped up in something even greater. Okay. So next point that I want to get to that sort of connects with some of the things that I've said, and kind of what I want to do is talk a little bit about what Plato sees as some of the dangers of art. But then I'm going to go on to what he thinks are some of the great things. And in certain ways for Plato, it boils down to the fact that he just thinks art is very powerful. And so it's powerful for good, and it's also like really powerful for evil. And so it's important to sort of understand that it has the power that it does over us, and that we use it responsibly. So in the Apology, and some of you guys may be familiar with this story, because this is sort of the big story about Socrates that usually you hear first. So Socrates in the Apology tells a story about him having a friend go to the Delphic Oracle, which in Greek society would have been this place where they ask a question and they get an answer that they consider to be from the gods. And by the way, Plato was one of the first, Socrates and Plato were one of the first in their day to believe in a single god as opposed to multiple gods. So Homer was really big on multiple gods. Polytheism was rampant. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all of them, believed in order to believe in goodness, absolute standard of goodness, you have to believe in one God. That you need one God to have an absolute standard of goodness. So anyway, Socrates' friend Chaerephon goes to the Delphic Oracle and asks who's the wisest man in the world.
and the Delphic oracle says it's Socrates. And so Chaerephon goes and tells Socrates, I asked the Delphic oracle and they said this about you, and Socrates just doesn't believe it. He thinks it's just the craziest thing that he's ever heard. And he says, I feel so, like I have so little knowledge, this surely can't be true. And so he says, well, what I'll do is I'll go to the people who I consider the wisest in the city, and I'll see what they know, and see how much wisdom they have, and surely I'll find that they have far more than I do. And he famously goes and talks to three sets of people, one of which is going to be important for our discussion, but the three are politicians, artists, and craftsmen. It's sort of in that order too. So the kind of the most powerful of the city, and then the sort of medium powerful ones, and then the ones that are more the more of the artisans, the lower classes, but still sort of respected in a way. What happens when he goes to each of these three types is he asks them about their knowledge, and they start to speak about very confidently what they know. And the more he asks them, the more he realizes that they don't know what they think that they know. And so the politicians, they're so good at being persuasive. They're like leader type personalities, so they speak and everyone just believes them because they're just so powerful in their presence. And so because people are just kind of under a spell when they speak, they believe that they really actually know it all too. I mean, everyone thinks it's true when they say it, so obviously it is. And so Socrates leaves them realizing, okay, well, I'm at least wiser than they are, not because I know things, but at least because I know that I don't know them. And they don't seem to know that. Goes to the artists and experiences the same thing. So the artists are able to create these beautiful master works, and the poets are able to write these amazing things. And you encounter them and you think, this person must have like a connection to God. Like there's just this overwhelming sense of something beyond this world that's there. And the poet knows that they have created this thing. But then when Socrates asks them about it, asks them to sort of explain it, how does this apply to life, they actually can't really talk much about their work at all, or talk about the other things. Although they kind of believe that because they can write beautifully about this thing, they also know everything about it as well. So he has the same experience with the artist where he leaves knowing, okay, it's not that I know anything, but I at least know more than they do that I don't know. And they seem to be under the impression that they know quite a lot. They're almost in a privileged group. Craftsmen are, it's the same thing, although it's slightly different. They're very good at one thing, and so their overconfidence comes more in believing that because they're really good at this one thing, they don't need to know anything about anything else. And so, I'm really good at fixing cars, therefore why would I ever need to know anything about, poetry or music or God? I don't know. There's just sort of this almost complacency in their spirit. And so he says, like, his wisdom in that case just comes from knowing that there still is more for him to know. So the group that I think is significant is the artist, because I think that these three types of people have different things that make them tempted to think they know more than they do. And so I think, and this is, I want it to like open this up for discussion. I think one example of this is like movie stars, who are just, they're loved, they're idolized by everyone in the world in a strange way, maybe in the United States especially. And so like we want to know not just like their theory on acting, but like all their views on politics, and like all their views on theology, and like they're the divine like source like for these things, and they maybe even are convinced that because they can act so well in this movie, they also really have everything to say on all these other things. So I wanted to ask you all, and some of this is like also possibly you thinking about your own maybe temptations in this area of possibly like overconfidence. What do you think are some of the temptations of artists to lack what Socrates is like in Plato's initial definition of wisdom is, which is knowing what you don't know? So any thoughts?
I don't know how to put it in words, but it seems when I first started looking into art that this is my piece,
Mm-hmm.
and it's what I know. And if you don't like it, that's fine.
Yeah.
But this is what I know and what I see.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't see it, well, so bad.
I'll just take it back to my little cave and like
Uh-huh.
just like stay commune with its brilliance and genius or something.
I don't
Yeah.
know if I said that right.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, they don't know. I mean, it's like, okay, you can't have another view.
Right.
Because I know.
right,
And this is what I know.
Right.
And it's visible for you to see what I know.
right, right.
I don't know. I don't know if I said that right, but
Yeah.
This may be utterly off topic,
Mhm.
but the artist to me is, I guess, like in the history of Bible translation and the scribes passing down text after text after text. Often a scribe was illiterate,
Mhm.
so they could draw the symbols,
Mhm.
but they couldn't understand or read it.
Mhm.
And I kept thinking of the artist in that role as sort of this conduit of,
Mhm.
transcendental,
Yes.
the
Almost
beauty,
prophetic.
turning it into, the brick and mortar and marble and paint and song,
Mhm.
but not necessarily being gifted with the full ramifications or the understanding. And so you have the artist and the art critic.
Mhm.
Don't know if that hit on what you were asking.
No,
about.
definitely, yeah.
To tag on to that, because thank you, John, because you formulated what I couldn't quite put together, brings for me as an artist the frustration of the artist's statement. Because
Yes.
it's like, I've created something, I love it, it represents, like you were saying, it's mine, if you don't like it.
Your meaning,
But,
yeah.
but then to sit down and have to write formally about it,
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I'll sit there and go, I don't know,
Mhm.
I know what happened,
Mhm.
and
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, it's one of the most horrifying things you can make me do,
Right.
is write about my work.
Right. And Plato and Aristotle, or Plato and Socrates, they're not going to say you are at fault for being in that position. They actually think that Plato's like highest description of art is what he calls a kind of divine madness, where
That's the crazy artist goes all the way back to
yeah, and he thinks like there's actually something really healthy in this experience when you create art or even experience art of being forced out of yourself, and you like have to let go of all the analytical boxes that you put everything in, and you actually have this sense that like something is you're a vessel and not just the super original creator. And so like he thinks if that humbles you, if that experience humbles you and does this to you, then great, like awesome. But if it puts you in the class of wow, like that person creates things that they must have all of the wisdom in the world, since they made that.
I
Yeah.
was glad you said that, because it's kind of ironic, because usually the artist is a very insecure person, and if he stumbles into greatness, he did it because of the creator
Yes.
of whatever gift he was bestowed.
Yes.
And then he kind of gets in the way of it
Yep.
because of the reactions of the world.
Yes.
And really, the ultimate is God put this person together and put a stamp on him,
Yep.
and the greatness, he just happened to
Absolutely.
be there at the right time, in the right place, with the right reactions. Does that
Absolutely.
make sense?
Oh yeah.
So it's a little ironic,
Mhm.
and what's interesting, because the artist can be one of the most insecure persons
Mhm.
in the world as they start off, and then if they stumble into greatness, it's all of a sudden. I've seen some of the. I'm trying to think of the artist that does the bullseyes. I remember being in art school.
Jasper Johns.
Jasper Johns.
Mhm.
And my art teacher said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I know he had great technique and everything, but when they interviewed him,
Mhm.
he really came real inarticulate and really didn't know what the heck he
Right.
was doing.
Right.
And yet,
Yep.
what did you think? And I didn't want to say, well, I was kind of.
Yeah,
Just to overstay,
Yes.
because
Yes.
I certainly wouldn't put myself in.
Right.
Am I making sense?
Oh, you are, and like so, and it's just so interesting, like we as human beings, how we react to that feeling of insecurity. So, one way to react to that insecurity, which I think is like just a very beautiful theological way, is to realize how much of this has come from God, and how much of it is like a gift that you are just serving the world with, and really stepping aside and letting it do what God wants to let it do. But another way of responding to that insecurity is thinking, well, I don't have to use words, to explain myself. I mean, if you can't see it, then you obviously, you're not brilliant.
And a greater thing is if you can't perceive what only a minority of us can,
Yes.
you must be stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the curators of art museums, and sometimes the kind of art they let in, they have that view. It's like, piece of cheese with mold on it. It's like genius, and but we know why, but no one else does. And so it's interesting. I mean, in certain ways, I think the artists, because of that lack of ability to articulate often, we're in a beautiful place to be humble, and to realize our indebtedness to our Creator. But there's this thing we can do with it that twists it, that makes us put ourselves above. Yeah.
I've always been hesitant to talk about or title my piece because I've always been more interested to see the response of someone else, fresh and clean,
Yes.
without being guided in any way.
Yeah. I have two. I'm in a weird spot because I love words, and I have the philosopher in me, and so I love to put words and images next to each other and then see what happens when that happens. But I do think that there's just a lot that can happen with your piece with someone if they don't know the title. They just encounter it, and it does something, and like it's one of those instances where it's like when God gives you the words that someone needs to hear, and you don't even know why, but it does. It's like your piece speaks to them in the way that it was meant to, and you didn't have the design in it, and it's good that you didn't have to have it all in your head, because you wouldn't have been able to. Only God can do that.
Yeah, he was basically saying, when I was about to say that so much of art for me and putting it out there is to stand, one of my favorite things to do in the show is to actually stand back away from it and listen to what people say to each other when they go and they see it, because every single time something of mine is up on display, people see things in it that never would have occurred to me.
Yeah.
And I hear that and I go,
Oh gosh,
oh
yes.
my gosh, that's right there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Christi, I don't know if this will take you in the wrong direction, but the word value comes to mind as I think about this discussion. Not necessarily in terms of dollar value, but if we are conduits and we really don't know anything, something is just passing through, and then a Jasper John sort of hits a bullseye, with the market, and suddenly, hordes of people are flocking to him because he is
The greatest artist God.
well, the greatest artist. He must know something. What's he doing right? I want to, or whatever's going on. That's sort of driving the crowds that way. And in a sense, if we're a believer who's an artist, you wonder what's the real value, because I didn't do it.
Yeah.
It's no different than a flower blooming in the desert.
Right. Right.
It has value in and of itself, and
Right.
so I don't know if there's knowledge to be gained from that, but it blooms, it withers, it dies, unseen, and here we are blooming, and we'll wither and we'll die, but we want to be seen.
Right. Right.
And we want to have value attributed to
Right.
it. And-
Right. We do. I mean, but then that's our chains, right?
Yeah.
I mean that's what imprisons us. because in a certain way it puts us in a horizontal relationship to reality instead of a vertical one. And so we're enslaved to pleasing fallen men.
And your words there, God even said at one point that I felt very clear expression came as, why do you want to be enslaved?
Yeah.
Why not just make and enjoy and not think about it?
Right. So one of the things that is big in Plato, and it's I really like the nuance that he puts on this, and this is why and I'm just going to put this on the board because this is how he talks about it, divine madness.
I love that term.
Yeah, and there's several aspects of it. If I had hours, I could go into sort of I think there's kind of 4 kinds of divine madness he talks about. I'm not going to go into them, but it's a sort of how did I write it down? Okay, so this is the way I think he thinks of it: the God-given being beside oneself, state of being. So there's a way that we can exist and have this feeling of self-possession, like we have a plan, we are going to take these steps to get there, and it sort of makes rational sense. Our reason is putting things into categories, and we know what's going on. We can articulate ourselves in words. So what he thinks happens in art is that we're knocked off that pedestal of self-possession. But if it's given by God, and he thinks a lot of times it's not. So sometimes what it is we're knocked off and we're driven into our pleasures, for instance. Or we're knocked off and we're driven into pleasing other people, or whatever. But if we're knocked off in a God-given way, then we are put in this place where we feel taken outside of ourselves and asked to surrender to something greater. And what he thinks is awesome and dangerous about that is that when you lose your self-possession, your sense of self-possession, that means something else gains supremacy. Okay? And if it's going well, it's God that gains supremacy. But what else could gain supremacy if you're not beside yourself? I mean, Romeo and Juliet, they're kind of knocked outside of themselves for love. Not that I'm saying that they shouldn't have killed themselves in their diehard, love of one another. But I don't know. There's something strange about when something else is given that place of supremacy when we're knocked off out of our place of self-possession. And so he thinks it's this really kind of scary feeling that you feel when you either create art or sort of blown away by art, where you're not standing on the solid place that you were before. But he says it's going to be doing something amazing to you if what it's doing is it's putting you in this sort of surrendered place into God's hands. And I think that the challenge for the Christian artist is how to do that, how to create art that does that. And I think part of it is that it does it to you while you're creating it. That you're sort of very aware of your self-possession being surrendered to the divine. But I think it also has to do with knowing other people and knowing something that you share with them that puts them into this state of, in certain ways, awakens a hunger and desire in them that has been sort of laying there asleep. And all of a sudden they realize that they were made for more. And that God is ultimately that more that they're hungry for. Any thoughts?
I know there are certain instances where it will be totally disproven. Do you think you can increase in divine madness through years' experience or years?
Yeah, Yeah, that's tricky. So can you control your divine badness? Can you control when God gifts you or not? I mean, you know, there's a lot of writers that go through like intense writer's block, and they're like waiting for the inspiration to come. Certain ways, I feel like being a good artist, like as a Christian, it's like putting your place where you're available for God to use you, and you're waiting patiently for Him to, in the way that and you're not pushing it to work in a way that maybe you haven't. I don't know. There's a sort of letting go. I feel like when like really good art is taking place, letting something else be leading you. So I don't know. I think that it's a little bit dangerous when you think about like wanting to control how much divine madness occurs in you, because I think like maybe it's like grace, the way grace is a gift that it's bestowed on you. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think about artists and writers that have what I refer to as like a daily ritual, where they write or they paint religiously, you know, because it's a discipline. It's a discipline. They've got it blocked out, and their claim is it keeps the block from happening.
Right.
But we all know that there's going to be work that's better than others, and then I sit and and then I struggle, you know, with the whole block idea. But then you have to sit and wonder would their work be as strong, whether or not they did you know, because they have, you know, they get hit with, you know, they're not in a block, they have a divine menace, they're outside themselves.
Right.
You know, so I don't know, I don't know if the discipline makes a difference or not. But
Yeah. I mean, I think in the way that spiritual disciplines can help the spiritual life, that like you decide I'm going to read the Bible today, even though it's not going to fill me, my heart's not going to like overflow with emotion. Like I'm still going to put myself in a place to hear the scriptures.
Right.
I think like things like that, I think they do like make a really big difference. But I think also like, so you were saying that you in the past year you haven't been able to create as much art because of like life circumstances. So it might be though that like in that same way, like God uses even times of dryness from divine madness to cultivate in you a hunger and a humility for Him that ends up making the divine madness when it comes even better, like even more awesome than it would have been if you were just sort of creating awesome things every day.
I also think that even if you're not creating art, you are in a way in your mind processing things, and at least I am. I would think.
Yeah.
I'm
most
very aware.
artists.
Yeah, I'm very aware. Even when I'm doing the dry period, I'm still processing. Like I still view things. I know I'm very aware of viewing things very differently than other people do. Sometimes
Yeah.
I think of it as incubating.
Yeah.
But that's where the technique, like the discipline comes in with the technique, because you may
Right.
have something that you want to accomplish, but you don't know how to get there if
Right.
if you don't
Right.
practice and develop.
Right. You can't just say, I'm not going to do any work at learning this trade, and I'm just going to wait till God hits me with His like lightning and then create genius works. Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of pride, right? Yeah, that's a pride that Socrates would like say, no, like you've missed it. Yeah.
I love the film, and I just rewatched it recently, Finding Forrester, about a writer. The aged famous writer is teaching the student, and he's sitting there the student is looking at the blank page, and the writer says, "Don't think, just write." And then he goes through the pages later, the teacher, highlighting the parts that are bad, Xing them off, and then highlighting the parts that are good, and then go back and write again.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, like
Yeah.
the technique, like she was saying, you know, if you're stuck with a visual canvas and you don't know what to do, just start working it.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
And if you've used it up, put it aside and do another one.
Right. Another really big thing that we could spend forever on, we won't, because I want to give you guys some Aristotle, that Plato talks about is the importance for the artist to have an ordered, what he calls an ordered soul. And he has what is referred to as, by scholars, a sort of model of what's called a tripartite soul. And all that means is 3 parts of the soul that he sees going on: reason, will, and desire. And he thinks that they should be in this order in us. And by reason, this is a little misleading. By reason, he doesn't mean rational certainty. He more means being led by truth.
This
So-
Plato or Aristotle?
This is Plato. Yeah. Actually, and Aristotle ends up borrowing this, so Aristotle totally goes with it. But Plato, just one of the things that he does so well in the Republic is he describes these types of people where the will is the ruling element of them. He calls it the spirited person. He describes people that are in the army in his day as sort of having like lots of the spiritedness in them, but the spiritedness is leading the reason instead of the other way around. He thinks actually the majority of people have desire ruling them. So that in some ways desire decides what's true, and desire decides what you act upon, as opposed to truth deciding what you act upon and truth deciding what you will. And so he thinks that if when you're doing art, if it really does take you outside yourself, then if the person that's being taken outside of themselves has already a disordered soul, if you already have desire leading you without you even kind of realizing it, then you being taken outside of yourself is going to possibly do really dangerous things. And create things that maybe appeal to the lowest thing in people, as opposed to the highest thing. And so I think one way to make yourself ready to be brought into this kind of state and use it the right way is to make sure, is truth the thing that's leading me? What I ought to do, not just what I want to do, but what I ought to do, what I ought to believe, what I ought to feel, what I ought to love. The way Augustine's going to end up talking about this, instead of an ordered soul, he's going to talk about it as ordered loves. What we love most, what we love least, that we can't help but be beings that love and worship, but what do we worship most? And what's subordinated to that. Okay, so Aristotle. We have like 15 minutes. So I'm sorry, Aristotle. His big work, there's several works from Plato where you get a lot of his theories on art. So there isn't just one. There is one in Aristotle that is sort of the work that if you were taking aesthetics class, they would say this is what you should read. And it's called the Poetics. And in certain ways, it's really just a book about how to do tragedy. He talks about plot and character and spectacle and how to come up with something that is a good tragedy. He was supposed to do something on comedy as well, but we lost it, or he never finished it. We're not really sure. But in the like process describing what makes for a good tragedy, he says a lot about what makes for good art. And one of the things that he is so the way in which he's disagreeing with Plato in it is Plato tends to be wary of art that we cling to because it makes all these emotions start releasing out of us. So like one of the examples I used to use with my students is when I was in like college, like my friends would like go through these horrible breakups, and like they would have these like breakup like music soundtracks they would listen to that would just make them cry like tons. But like, well, first it would be like cry tons, and then it would be like, you're great, you don't need him, whatever, like woman power. But like it was like music that would intentionally draw out like all of these emotions, sometimes really self-indulgent ones. And so Plato is wary of art that does that because he's not sure that our reasons for loving it is always good. And he isn't always sure that it trains our emotions to love the right things in the right way. Aristotle kind of, I mean, so in the Poetics, he does say here are some danger areas, but he actually makes a really strong argument for what he calls catharsis. And the big thing that the big like way that he describes it is art that makes the feelings of pity and fear arise in our soul. And he thinks that the greatest art will draw these emotions out of us, and that in the process of doing that will cleanse us in a way that we, in some ways, we get it out. Like we sort of gotten the emotions out that we needed to, and we can go on and like live lives that are more ordered, in more control. He doesn't say a lot. He sort of states it with tons of certainty, and then sort of moves on. So this is a little bit something I think more something we can discuss. One of the things he does say, he talks a lot about the tragic hero. He does say that it's important when you are creating a subject that you want your audience to pity, that they be someone who actually you care about. So he says, like, if you have a scoundrel as the main character of your tragedy, and something bad happens to him, you're not going to have a ton of pity for him. Like, that's not going to draw this, like, oh, how could he die sort of feeling. I mean, it's sort of like in really bad action scary movies, they make like the most annoying characters like die off first, and so you don't really feel that bad when they're like, and you can even tell like as you're watching the movie they're not presenting this character very well. They're probably going to die first, you know. And so he says, like, if you want to create a really deep sense of pity, you create a character that is of a really, in certain ways, good moral worth. And interestingly, he says, don't make him perfect. If you make someone who's perfect, the audience won't feel like they have anything in common with them. He'll be so far above that when he falls, you kind of almost have this vague, not sure what to think, kind of, it's almost like distant. So it says, you know, he has to have moral worth so that so you're really actually afraid for what's going to happen to him, and you have pity when his downfalls arise.
Is that the Walter White syndrome?
What is that?
Breaking Bad?
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Or you don't want him to be too pitiful that you go, oh, it was your own fault.
Oh, right. No,
There's
definitely. Yes, yeah.
There's that delicate
Yes, there is.
balance of a character that you
Yes.
go
So,
to identify with him. Oh, but
Right.
you meant to do. Yeah.
Right, so, yeah,
Otherwise, you're stupid. You know?
Right. No, it's interesting because Aristotle kind of goes into some of the details about even the fatal flaw of the tragic hero, that the degree to which it needs to be not their fault, the degree to which it sort of is. He says if it's completely not their fault, then the audience doesn't work with morality in a way that they should. So it needs to have some of that there, but not in a way that you're just sort of like, oh yeah, you just set up your own funeral, you know. I have no pity. So he thinks that really good art actually serves this role of drawing out emotions in us that we kind of have put aside, like we can't deal with them all day because we won't get our work done. But then when we have some space to encounter them and cry and feel deeply, there's something deep in our soul that gets to be expressed that's like breathing. And then we can go on and sort of go and live through the next day. And I think that this is sort of tricky because I think that, I just even think about like our culture, and we're like obsessed with entertainment, obsessed with it. And like video games and movies and things that make us like unwind in the evenings. And so much of it almost just keeps our soul sort of sleepy.
Nothing.
Yeah. And you almost, it's like, I even feel like some of my, like, my students, my sixth graders, who fight these, like, these video games, like, I feel like they were created to fight battles. God created us to, use the armor of God to fight, like, strong things. but I almost feel like all of that desire is being sapped out of them. They're like, oh yeah, I just like shot these monsters, and so I feel good, you know, I can just go through the rest of the next day and I've got that out of my system, sort of thing. And so I don't know how much the cleansing is actually doing what it ought to do. The really tricky thing for an artist is how to create art that does arouse pity and fear, that does it in a way that doesn't numb the soul. I mean, for some people, they seek it out because they're trying to escape themselves. So they'll cry over things happening in a movie, really because there's bad things happening at home. They don't really want to deal with that, so they'll deal with this and then kind of go on and kind of exist the next day. So there's some trick to making this arise in a person, but not in a way that allows them to escape themselves, but somehow puts them face to face with themselves, and even leads to action. Any thoughts on? Yes.
It's interesting. I think Shakespeare did it, and there was a playwright named Bertolt Brecht.
Mm-hmm.
He would pull you in, cathartic, and then he jams you out of it. Now stop. Now think. And I even wonder when Shakespeare uses his comedy and his tragedies, because the modern day audience, obviously, when you watch Eugene O'Neill, it's like, oh, spare me. 3 hours of this, I want to go cut my wrist. Long day's journey into the night.
Yeah.
You feel like you're this cold because we can only take so much tragedy.
Right.
But it seemed like some of the playwrights had this gift to go, we get that.
Yeah.
So we're going to take you out of that a little bit. Even the new play, Osage County or something, it's really a horrific tragedy. The movie wasn't like the play, but they had this, you had to laugh. You had to release, and then you could step back and kind of analyze it a little bit.
Yeah.
So you actually got more out of it.
Yeah.
Okay, now think.
Yeah.
Stop just staying in the, does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does.
So, and it seems like Shakespeare knew how to do that too.
Yeah.
You go, well, isn't that funny? He's got comedy coming
Right,
now.
right, right, right.
I think he knew something about.
Oh, and comedians. I mean, this is why the jester of the court often was the one who spoke the most truth, right?
Yes.
So they were able to say through comedy what no one else would be willing to hear in any other way.
It's just like we can't go down the streets of Calcutta and we're crying, that it's too much.
Right.
Somehow we go into denial, which is what you were saying. There's just we can only take so much as humans.
Right.
And then we're not in reality.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yes.
I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is going to necessarily fit. I'm not sure I'm hearing everything accurately, but there are things within each one of us, stresses that are down within each one of us, and rather than deal with them, we mask, we hide.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we need to go down a psychology road here, but I know that that's true, and the best way to deal with them is to get them before the Lord, let Him get into them, and deliver the truth that's necessary. Right. What you're talking about there is an art that masks, or assuages, or anesthetizes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm not sure that's what I want to be a part of.
Right.
You did say at one point, make something that doesn't numb the senses. We're talking about tragedies that sort of vicariously work out our stresses, but really what we've done is that's our solution to the problem that's within that we don't want to deal with.
Right.
And in reality, we really need to let it come to the surface.
Right.
And let the Lord work with us on that.
Right.
And an art form that allows that to happen is better, but my goodness, what does that look like?
Right, absolutely. Well,
What is it?
And really good Christian art, I think often brings suffering to a much more transparent, almost like naked level than maybe a lot of other stuff out there. And in a certain way, like for me, I'm like a super emotional person, and so when I like realize someone else like has a hard time making it through the day, I'm like, if we could talk, like bit big, get it, and I feel like I can come a little bit outside of my hole of like just hold it all together and make it through the day. And so I mean I do think that art that like kind of draws that honesty out of you, and says like, well, look, suffering is part of even the life that the believer is called to, and so like, but how are you suffering? How are you using it? I mean, and really, what for the Christian cleansing is cleansing like often happens through repentance. So one question might be to ask, how can art lead you to a state of repentance, where the emotions that arise are possibly are like emotions of conviction, and this need, like you said, to take all these things that you're holding in and place them before the Lord and ask Him to cleanse them.
Well, it's like an encounter with beauty. True beauty is liberating, not enslaving.
Right.
And it doesn't cover up or mask, but it blows away.
Yes.
And that's a discussion for maybe 2 or 3 weeks from now when we get down the road here. I know you're just dealing with
Sure. No. Well, and I just think there's such a careful line, and everyone needs something slightly different. But like, this is why sometimes really, really happy Christian art like doesn't do it, because it more is like, oh, just think positive, like give thanks to God and everything, and you're good, Thomas Kincaid or whatever. Not that I'm against it, just
I'm against it.
Okay. So like I mean I think so Christ was a man of sorrows. He also did. We also are told to rejoice in everything. So there's this one end of like be happy all the time.
Would that be beauty without truth?
Possibly so. Yeah. No. That's actually good. Maybe beauty without truth. But then there's this other side, which is like kind of indulge in the horribleness of the world, and indulge in I'm such a misunderstood victim, and like.
Take on a martyr complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Where there isn't any like reaching out to God to actually save you, in belief that He can. And so I think like when you create art, you have to walk this fine line between pulling people into that self-indulgence, or on the other hand, like let's cover it all up and be super happy. And I think Christ is like I think this is like why I just come back to Him and think how beautiful His person is, because I think that those two things, the hope and the suffering, are both there in Him. And maybe the more that we know Him, the more that we're in fellowship with Him, the more that that balance will come into the art that we create. So, okay, we're